Chapter 1. I Go to Styles. The strong public interest in the Styles case is over now. But because the case was so famous, I have been asked to write an account of the whole story, to prevent any more sensational rumours. This is how I, Captain Arthur Hastings, became involved with the affair. I was wounded while fighting in the Great War, and sent home to recover. I had no close relatives or friends, and was wondering where to stay, when I met my friend John Cavendish. John was a friendly man of about 45, much older than me. I had not seen him for many years, but when I was a boy I often stayed at Styles, his mother's country house in Essex. We talked about old times, and John kindly invited me to stay at Styles to rest. "My mother will be delighted to see you again," he added. "Is your mother well?" I asked. "Oh, yes. Did you know she has married again?" I was surprised. John's mother, Emily, must now be 70 years old. I remembered her as an energetic woman with a strong personality. She married John's father after his first wife had died, leaving him with 2 sons, John and Lawrence. When John's father died, he left Styles and most of his money to Emily, his second wife, and his older son John would inherit Styles only after she died. Though this was unfair, Emily was very generous to the 2 boys, and they thought and spoke of her as their own mother. Lawrence, John's younger brother, had qualified as a doctor, but then abandoned the medical profession. He lived at Styles and wrote poetry, which was not very successful. John's profession had once been the law, but now he and his wife also lived at Styles. I suspected he would prefer his own house, but his mother had all the money, and she liked to control everyone. John noticed my surprise at the news of his mother's marriage. "It's making life very difficult for us, Hastings. This man, Alfred Inglethorpe, arrived from nowhere, saying he was Evie's second cousin. Evelyn Howard is Mother's companion. Mother employed him as a secretary. But we were shocked when she married him a few months ago. He's 20 years younger than she is, and I'm sure he just wants her money." 3 days later, I arrived by train at the station of Styles St. Mary. John Cavendish was waiting on the platform, and his car was outside. He looked at his watch. "We don't have time to collect Cynthia." "Is Cynthia your wife?" "No. Cynthia Murdoch is the daughter of an old friend of my mother's. Mother rescued Cynthia when her parents died, and she's lived with us for nearly 2 years. She works in the hospital at Tadminster." It was a warm day in early July. As we drove, I admired the Essex countryside, green and peaceful in the sun. It was hard to believe that a war was being fought not far away. John said, "It's very quiet here, Hastings. My wife Mary works on the land, because so many men are away fighting. She's up at 5 every morning to milk the cows. It's a good life. Or it would be, if only Alfred Inglethorpe wasn't here. We arrived at the fine old house. A lady, who was gardening, stood up as we approached. "Hello, Evie. Here's our wounded hero. Mr. Hastings, this is Miss Evelyn Howard. We call her Evie." Miss Howard shook my hand with a strong grip. She was a pleasant-looking woman of 40, with very blue eyes and a sun-tanned face. She had a large, square body and a deep voice like a man's. "Come and have tea, Evie," said John. "You've done enough gardening for today." "Yes," said Miss Howard, removing her gardening gloves. "I think you're right." She led us round the house to where tea was being served in the shade of a large tree. And, as we approached, John's wife, Mary, came to meet us. I'll never forget my first sight of Mary Cavendish. She was tall and slim, with wonderful dark eyes. Although she was very calm and quiet on the outside, I imagined that inside she was wild and free. Her voice was low and clear. Suddenly, I was very glad that I had come to Styles. As we were having tea, a white-haired old lady stepped out of the house onto the grass, followed by a younger man. Mrs. Emily Inglethorpe greeted me with enthusiasm. "I'm delighted to see you again. Alfred, darling, this is Mr. Hastings." I looked curiously at Alfred, darling. He had a long black beard and wore gold-framed glasses and strange clothes. He didn't seem to belong there. He looked as if he should be on stage, like an actor, not here at Styles in real life. "This is a pleasure, Mr. Hastings," said Mr. Inglethorpe in a deep voice. Then he said to his wife, "Emily, dearest, that cushion is damp." She smiled happily at him as he brought another cushion with tender care. It was clear that no one else liked Mr. Inglethorpe. Miss Howard, in particular, could not hide her feelings. But Mrs. Inglethorpe didn't notice. She talked steadily, and her husband was very attentive to her. I disliked him immediately, and my first opinions are usually right. While we drank tea, we talked of my profession. After the war, I wanted a fresh start. "If you could do anything," asked Mary Cavendish, "what would you choose?" "Well," I said, "I've always wanted to be a detective. I had a friend in Belgium, a very famous detective. He said that method was the key to all good detective work. He was a marvellous little man, and wonderfully clever." "I like a good detective story," remarked Miss Howard, "though they are often nonsense. With a real crime, the family would know who the murderer was. If I was involved in a murder, I would know him at once. The murderer might be a woman, I suggested. Yes, but murder's a violent crime. I think of a murderer as a man. Not if it's poison, said Mary Cavendish. What a horrible conversation, said Mrs. Inglethorpe. It makes me feel uncomfortable. Oh, here's Cynthia. A young girl in hospital uniform ran lightly across the lawn. You're late today, Cynthia. Mr. Hastings, this is Miss Murdoch. Cynthia Murdoch was a fresh-looking young woman, full of life and energy, with beautiful red hair. She sat down on the ground beside John, and, as I gave her a plate of sandwiches, she smiled up at me. You work in the hospital at Tadminster, don't you, Miss Murdoch? I said. Yes, I work in the pharmacy, with the drugs and medicines. How many people do you poison? I asked, smiling. Cynthia smiled too. Oh, hundreds. Cynthia, interrupted Mrs. Inglethorpe, can you write a few notes for me? Certainly, Aunt Emily. Cynthia stood up quickly. I remembered that she was dependent on Mrs. Inglethorpe, who did not let her forget it. Then Mrs. Inglethorpe turned to me. John will show you your room, which looks out over the park. To save money because of the war, we now have a simple supper at 7:30, and we don't waste anything at Styles. Even every little piece of waste paper is saved and sent away. Later on, from my window, I saw John walking and laughing with Cynthia Murdoch, until Mrs. Inglethorpe impatiently called her back to the house. Just then I saw John's younger brother, Lawrence Cavendish. He was about 40, with dark hair and a sad, clean-shaven face. He seemed upset about something, and I wondered what it was. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, and I dreamed that night of John's wife, Mary Cavendish. The next day was bright and sunny. I spent an enjoyable afternoon walking in the woods with Mary, returning to the house at 5. We met John Cavendish as we entered the hall. His face told me that something was wrong, and we followed him into the library. Evie's had an argument with Mother, and she's leaving, he told us. Just then Evelyn Howard entered, carrying a small suitcase. She looked excited but determined. Emily won't forgive me for this. I told her, your husband is 20 years younger than you and married you for money. Ask your Alfred how often he visits Farmer Rakes's pretty young wife. He's a bad man, I said, and I won't be surprised if he murders you for your money. She was very angry. What did Mother say? Asked John. Miss Howard frowned. She said, My darling Alfred, these are terrible lies. Get out of my house. So, I'm leaving, now. Nothing would change her mind. So finally John went to get the car, and Mary followed him. When we were alone, Miss Howard leaned towards me. "Look after my poor Emily, Mr. Hastings. They all want her money. Now I'm leaving, I can't protect her." "Of course, Miss Howard," I said. "I'll do everything I can." "Keep your eyes open," she said as she moved to the door, "and watch that devil, her husband." Then Miss Howard was surrounded by people saying goodbye. The Inglethorpes did not appear. As the car drove away, Mary Cavendish went to meet a tall man with a beard who was approaching the house. Her face turned red as she shook his hand. "Who is that?" I asked. I didn't trust the man from the first moment I saw him. "That's Dr. Bowerstein," said John. "He's staying in the village, recovering from an illness. He's a top London doctor, an expert on poisons." "And he's a great friend of Mary's," said Cynthia. John Cavendish frowned and suggested a walk. "I hate to see Evie Howard leave," he said, as he and I walked through the woods. "She's a good friend." We didn't talk much, and on our way home we met a pretty young woman who smiled at us as we passed. "That's Mrs. Raikes," said John. "The one that Miss Howard—" "Yes," said John abruptly. I compared Mrs. Inglethorpe, a white-haired old lady, to this pretty young girl, and remembered what Evelyn Howard had said. To change the subject, I said to John, "Styles is really a wonderful old house." He nodded sadly. "Yes, it's a fine property. It would be mine now if my father had made a fair will, and then I'd have enough money. I'm in debt too, you know." "Can your brother Lawrence help?" "He's spent all his money on his poetry. We're all poor. Mother has been very generous until now, but since her marriage—" He stopped, frowning. This was when I first felt uneasy. Just for a moment, I had a feeling that something was badly wrong at Styles. Chapter 2. The 16th and 17th of July. I had arrived at Styles on the 5th of July. A couple of days later, I received a letter from Evelyn Howard saying that she was working as a nurse at the big hospital in Middlingham, 15 miles away. She begged me to tell her if Mrs. Inglethorpe wanted her to return to Styles. My days were peaceful. All that disturbed me was how often Mary Cavendish went walking with Dr. Bowerstein. I admit that I didn't understand why Mary liked him so much. Now we come to the events of the 16th and 17th of July, which I will describe in great detail. The 16th of July was a Monday. In the evening, Mrs. Inglethorpe was going to read a war poem at the village concert. So, in the morning, we decorated the village hall. After a late lunch, we rested in the garden. I noticed that my friend John seemed very excited and could not relax. After tea, Mrs. Inglethorpe went to lie down, and I played tennis with Mary Cavendish. Though we had an early supper, we all still had to hurry to reach the concert in time. The evening was a great success, and everyone loved Mrs. Inglethorpe's reading. Cynthia acted in a short play and stayed the night at a friend's house. The next morning, Mrs. Inglethorpe had breakfast in bed, but she appeared at 12:30 and took John's brother Lawrence and me out to lunch. On the way home, Lawrence suggested that we visit Cynthia at work. Mrs. Inglethorpe said that she had letters to write at home, so she would leave us at the hospital pharmacy, and we could come back with Cynthia later. At the hospital, Cynthia met us, looking very cool and sweet in her white uniform, and took us upstairs to the pharmacy. "What a lot of bottles!" I exclaimed, as I looked round the small room. "Do you know what's in them all?" "Say something original," complained Cynthia. "Everyone says that. And the next thing you're going to say is, 'How many people have you poisoned?'" I laughed and agreed. "If you knew how easy it is to poison someone by mistake, you wouldn't joke about it," she said. "Come on, let's have tea. I've got secret supplies in that cupboard." "No, Lawrence, that's the poison cupboard. The big cupboard. That's right." After tea, I followed Cynthia out to her little balcony, and she showed me the different rooms of the hospital. Lawrence stayed in the pharmacy, but after a few minutes, Cynthia called to him to come and join us. Lawrence was normally very shy and awkward, especially with Cynthia, but that afternoon they talked cheerfully together. I realized that he could be very charming. After a while, Cynthia looked at her watch. "I think I can lock up and go now." On the way home, we stopped at the village post office so I could buy some stamps, and I bumped into a little man on my way out. To my great surprise, he suddenly kissed me on both cheeks. "Mon ami Hastings," he said excitedly. "It is indeed my dear friend Hastings." "My dear Poirot," I exclaimed, "how wonderful to see you." I turned to Cynthia and Lawrence. "This is my old friend, the great Belgian detective, Monsieur Hercule Poirot," I explained. "I was talking about him the other day, but I haven't seen him for years." "I know Mademoiselle Cynthia," said Poirot. "It is thanks to Mrs. Inglethorpe that I am here. She has kindly given me a place to live, as I am, sadly, homeless because of the war. I am very grateful to her." Hercule Poirot was an extraordinary-looking little man. He was only 5 feet 4 inches tall. His head was egg-shaped, and his big moustache was very stiff. His clothes were always very neat, and he loved everything to be tidy and in order. Indeed, he was obsessed with order. He had once been an important detective in the Belgian police, and had solved some very difficult cases. He showed me the little house where he lived, and I promised to visit him very soon. "He's a dear little man," said Cynthia as we drove away. "I didn't know he was your friend." "Did you know he was famous?" I asked, and told her stories of Poirot's successes until we got home. As we entered the hall, Mrs. Inglethorpe came out of her study, looking upset. "Is there anything the matter, Aunt Emily?" asked Cynthia. "Certainly not," said Mrs. Inglethorpe loudly. Then she saw Dorcas, the maid, and told her to bring some stamps into the study. "Yes, madam," said the old servant. Then, after a pause, she added, "You look very tired, madam. Perhaps you should go to bed." "Not now. I have some letters to write before the post is collected. Have you lit the fire in my room, as I told you?" "Yes, madam." "Then I'll go to bed after supper." Mrs. Inglethorpe went into her study again, and Cynthia stared after her. "I wonder what's wrong," she said to Lawrence. He did not seem to hear her, because he just walked away. Cynthia and I decided to play tennis before supper, so I ran upstairs to fetch my tennis racket. Mary Cavendish was coming down the stairs, and I thought that she was also looking strange and a little upset. "Where's Mrs. Inglethorpe?" she asked. "In the study." She seemed to prepare herself for something, went quickly down the stairs to the study, and shut the door behind her. A few minutes later, I passed the open study window on my way to the tennis court, and overheard Mary Cavendish. "Then you won't show it to me?" she was saying, trying hard to control her voice. "My dear Mary," replied Mrs. Inglethorpe, "it has nothing to do with that." "Then show it to me." "It is not what you think. It is nothing to do with you at all." "Of course, I should have known you would protect him," said Mary bitterly. At the tennis court, Cynthia said excitedly, "Aunt Emily's had a big argument with Mr. Inglethorpe. Dorcas the maid told me. She was near the door. I wish I knew what it was about." I thought of Mrs. Rake's pretty face, and Evelyn Howard's warnings, but I didn't say anything. It was obvious that something important had happened that afternoon, and though I looked for John, I couldn't find him anywhere. I couldn't forget what I had overheard. What was it about? Mr. Inglethorpe was in the dining room when I came down to supper. As usual, his face had no expression, and again I thought how he didn't seem to belong at Styles. Mrs. Inglethorpe came downstairs at last. She still looked upset, and there was an uncomfortable silence during the meal. Normally, Inglethorpe was very attentive to his wife, playing the part of a loving husband, but today he was unusually quiet. After supper, Mrs. Inglethorpe immediately went back to her study. "Send my coffee in here, Mary," she called. "I have only 5 minutes before the post is collected." Cynthia and I sat by the open window in the drawing-room, and Mary Cavendish brought us our coffee. She seemed excited. "Will you take Mrs. Inglethorpe her coffee, Cynthia? I'll pour it out." "I'll take Emily her coffee," said Inglethorpe. He poured the coffee and went out of the room, carrying it carefully. Lawrence followed him, and Mary Cavendish sat down. The three of us sat in silence. The night was hot and still, and Mary said quietly, "It's almost too hot. We may have a thunderstorm." This peaceful moment ended when, from the hall, I heard a voice that I knew and disliked. Then Alfred Inglethorpe came in with Dr. Bowerstein, who was covered with mud. "What have you been doing, Bowerstein?" asked John, coming in from the hall. "Have some coffee and tell us all about it." "Thank you, I will," laughed Dr. Bowerstein, and told us that he had fallen into a river while looking at a very interesting plant. "I'm afraid I am very muddy and dirty." Just then Mrs. Inglethorpe called from the hall. "Please take my dispatch case upstairs, Cynthia. I'm going to bed." I stood up when Cynthia did, and John was close by me. So there were 3 people who could swear that Mrs. Inglethorpe was carrying her coffee, which she hadn't yet tasted, in her hand. My evening had been spoilt by Dr. Bowerstein, and I was glad when at last he stood up to go. "I'll walk to the village with you," said Mr. Inglethorpe. "I must see our land agent." He turned to John. "There's no need to stay up. I'll take the key."